Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. Sometimes the biggest love stories begin with the worst possible first impression. The crystal chandeliers above the Grand Crescent Hotel shimmered like captured stars, casting warm golden light across a ballroom where every polished smile seemed rehearsed and every designer gown whispered old money. A string quartet played softly beneath the gentle murmur of conversations, the clink of champagne glasses blending into the elegant rhythm of another Manhattan charity gala. Every guest appeared perfectly composed. Every camera flash searched for the next headline. But Elena Hartwell felt completely out of place. She tightened her grip around the small cart overflowing with ivory roses, white orchids, and eucalyptus branches, carefully steering it between round tables dressed in linen that probably cost more than a month of her rent. She wasn't here as a guest. She was simply filling in for another florist who had called in sick that morning. Flowers were easier than people, she often reminded herself. Flowers never judged the shoes you wore or the apartment you went home to. They only asked for light, water, and gentle hands. She brushed a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear as she glanced at the seating chart taped beside the ballroom entrance. Table 14 still needed fresh centerpieces. Her sneakers barely made a sound against the polished marble floor as she pushed the cart deeper into the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Across the room, Declan Whitmore forced another practiced smile. Billionaire founder, investor, philanthropist, single father. Every title sounded impressive in magazine interviews, yet none of them explained the exhaustion hidden behind his calm blue eyes. Tonight, he had promised his business partners exactly 2 hours before returning home to read his 8-year-old daughter her favorite bedtime story. That simple promise mattered far more than another networking event. Unfortunately, someone else had different plans. Vivian Sinclair moved gracefully through the ballroom like she already owned it. Elegant, confident, famous for appearing beside powerful men just long enough to become tomorrow's headline. She intercepted Declan before he could quietly excuse himself. "Leaving already?" she asked with a dazzling smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The photographers just arrived." Declan remained polite. "I have another commitment. One picture won't hurt. I'm afraid it might send the wrong message." She laughed softly and stepped closer. "Only if you let it." Several reporters noticed them immediately. Camera lenses turned in their direction. A television host whispered excitedly into her microphone. Rumors had followed them for months despite Declan denying every single one. Vivian, however, never seemed interested in correcting the stories. If anything, she encouraged them. Declan glanced toward the ballroom exit, calculating the fastest escape. Every path seemed blocked by guests eager to greet him. Then, almost by accident, he noticed Elena struggling to steady a tall arrangement of white lilies that had begun tipping sideways on her cart. She looked completely unaware that half the room was watching another drama unfold. For one impossible second, an idea crossed his mind. It was ridiculous, reckless, completely unlike him. Yet the cameras were moving closer every second. Vivian reached for his arm. Before she could touch him, Declan crossed the room in long, determined strides. Elena had just caught the vase before it slipped when she sensed someone standing beside her. She looked up, confused, meeting the steady gaze of a stranger whose face she vaguely recognized from business magazines displayed near grocery store checkout counters. Before she could say a single word, he gently placed one hand near her shoulder and quietly asked, "I'm sorry." The next heartbeat changed everything. He leaned forward and kissed her briefly, respectfully, just long enough for every camera flash in the ballroom to explode like lightning. Gasps rippled across the room. Conversation stopped. Even the quartet faltered for a single uncertain note before continuing. Elena froze. Completely, her eyes wide with disbelief, the scent of fresh roses surrounding them as dozens of photographers captured a moment neither of them had planned. Declan stepped back immediately, genuine regret already filling his expression. "I know this makes absolutely no sense," he said softly enough that only she could hear. "But I promise I'll explain." Elena stared at him, still clutching a single white rose she hadn't realized she was holding. Around them, whispers spread faster than wildfire. Every phone in the ballroom seemed to lift at once. Every curious face turned toward the florist and the billionaire. Finally, finding her voice, Elena asked the only question that mattered. "Who are you?" The silence inside the ballroom lasted only a few seconds before it dissolved into a storm of whispers, surprised laughter, and the endless clicking of camera shutters. Elena remained frozen beside her flower card, her pulse racing so loudly she barely heard the orchestra resume its melody. She had come to replace wilted centerpieces, not become the center of attention herself. Declan looked at the growing crowd and then back at her with unmistakable regret. "Please," he said quietly, "come with me for just 1 minute. I owe you an explanation." Elena should have walked away. Every sensible thought told her to leave before the evening became even more embarrassing. But curiosity held her in place. Without saying a word, she followed him through a side hallway that led to a quiet terrace overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The cool spring air felt like a welcome escape from the suffocating glamour inside. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. City lights stretched for miles below, and distant traffic hummed like a restless ocean. Declan finally broke the silence. "I am sorry. What I did was unfair to you." Elena folded her arms. "Unfair is one way to describe it." He nodded without arguing. "You have every reason to be angry." "Do you usually kiss strangers at charity events?" she asked, her voice calm despite the frustration in her eyes. A faint, embarrassed smile crossed his face. "Absolutely not." "Then why me?" He glanced toward the ballroom doors before answering. "There is someone inside who has spent months trying to convince the public that we are in a relationship. She refuses to accept the truth, and every event becomes another performance for the cameras. I made a terrible decision because I wanted the rumors to end." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "So I was your emergency exit." The words landed harder than he expected. For one foolish moment, yes, he admitted. "But you did not deserve to be dragged into any of this." She looked down at the white rose still resting in her hand. One of its petals had loosened during the confusion and drifted onto the stone floor between them. "You could have simply walked away," she said. "Instead, you turned a complete stranger into tomorrow's headline." Declan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card. "If there is anything I can do to repair the damage, I will." Elena glanced at the card without taking it. "You think this is about money?" "No. Because it sounds like you do." He slowly lowered his hand. "Then tell me how to make this right." She met his eyes for the first time since leaving the ballroom. They were not cold or arrogant like she had expected. They looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from long meetings, but the kind that settled into someone carrying responsibilities no one else could see. Still, sympathy was not enough to erase humiliation. "Money cannot erase embarrassment," she answered softly. "People will remember that kiss long after they forget my name." Declan had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without losing his composure, yet he found himself unable to respond. She was right. Every headline would identify him. She would simply become the mysterious florist. Before either of them spoke again, Elena noticed something glittering near the terrace doorway. She bent down and picked up a small pearl hair clip that must have slipped from her hair during the chaos. One tiny crystal had cracked, but it remained beautiful in its own imperfect way. She brushed it clean and clipped it back into place. Declan watched the quiet gesture without realizing he would remember it for weeks. A member of the hotel staff carefully opened the terrace door. "Miss Hartwell," he said politely, "your supervisor has been looking for you. The ballroom still needs the remaining floral arrangements." Elena gave a small nod. Work still needed to be finished. Bills still needed to be paid. Real life had not stopped simply because the evening had turned into gossip. She looked back at Declan one final time. "I accept your apology," she said. "But that does not mean I understand what you did." He offered a grateful nod. "That is more kindness than I deserve." She turned and walked toward the ballroom without another word, the scent of fresh roses following behind her. Declan remained alone beneath the night sky, watching the terrace door close. For reasons he could not explain, the image that stayed with him was not the unexpected kiss or the waiting reporters. It was the young woman who had refused to measure dignity with dollars. And somewhere inside the ballroom, completely unnoticed by both of them, a single white rose had slipped from Elena's flower cart and come to rest beside an empty chair, waiting for the moment when their paths would cross again. 3 days passed, yet the photographs refused to disappear. Every grocery store checkout line displayed another celebrity magazine with a blurred image of the billionaire and the mysterious florist. Online articles invented stories that had never happened. Some claimed she was his secret girlfriend. Others insisted she had planned the entire moment for attention. Elena ignored every headline the best she could. Real life did not pause for gossip. Every morning before sunrise, she unlocked the small neighborhood flower shop where she worked, filled metal buckets with fresh water, trimmed stems, and arranged bouquets for birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary Tuesdays. The fragrance of peonies and lavender always settled her mind. Flowers still made more sense than people. On a quiet Saturday morning, she knelt near the storefront window, finishing a spring arrangement when the bell above the entrance chimed. Without looking up, she smiled politely. "Good morning. I will be right with you." Tiny footsteps echoed across the wooden floor before a cheerful little voice asked, "Are all these flowers happy?" Elena looked up and found a young girl standing in front of a display of sunflowers. She appeared about 8 years old, wearing denim overalls, bright white sneakers, and 2 slightly uneven braids that suggested someone had tried very hard but was not especially skilled at doing hair. The child smiled with complete confidence, as though every stranger was simply a friend she had not met yet. Behind her stood Declan Whitmore, dressed in jeans, a navy sweater, and a baseball cap that failed to hide his familiar face. He looked almost relieved that she had noticed his daughter before noticing him. "Good morning," he said carefully. Elena blinked in surprise. Of all the places in Manhattan, this was the last one she expected to see him. Before either adult could speak again, the little girl pointed toward a bucket filled with pale blue hydrangeas. "Those look like clouds," she whispered. Elena laughed softly. "That is exactly what I thought the first time I saw them." The girl beamed. "See, Daddy? I told you flowers have personalities." Declan smiled with genuine affection. "You certainly did." He turned back toward Elena. "This is my daughter, Sophie." Sophie extended her hand with remarkable seriousness. "Nice to meet you. Daddy says shaking hands is important." Elena accepted the tiny handshake. "It is very nice to meet you too, Sophie." The little girl wandered toward another display, completely fascinated by the colors surrounding her. Declan lowered his voice. "I promise this was not planned." Elena raised one eyebrow. "You accidentally walked into my flower shop?" He chuckled quietly. "Not exactly. Sophie has been asking to visit one ever since she saw your arrangements at the gala. She remembered the flowers much more than anything else." Elena glanced toward Sophie, who was now gently smelling a white lily with obvious admiration. "She likes flowers? She loves creating things. Drawing, painting, building little gardens on our apartment balcony. I thought bringing her here would make her happy." Before Elena could answer, Sophie hurried back holding a small watering can, almost half her size. "Miss Elena, can I help?" Elena smiled despite herself. "Only if you promise not to give every flower a swimming pool." Sophie giggled. "I can do that." For the next 20 minutes, Elena showed her how to gently water young plants and remove faded petals without damaging healthy blooms. Sophie listened with complete concentration, asking endless questions about colors, seasons, and why roses had thorns if they were supposed to represent love. Declan watched quietly from across the shop. It had been months since he had seen his daughter laugh this freely with someone she had just met. Since losing her mother several years earlier, Sophie usually needed weeks before trusting new people. Yet somehow, Elena made kindness seem effortless. As Elena reached for another watering can, something slipped from the pocket of her apron. A worn sketchbook landed softly on the floor. Sophie picked it up before anyone else could. "You draw too?" she asked with sparkling eyes. Elena hesitated for only a second before accepting the notebook. "Sometimes. Mostly flower ideas that I hope to create one day." Sophie looked at her father with unmistakable excitement. "Daddy, can she teach me?" Declan met Elena's uncertain expression across the shop. Neither of them realized that one innocent question from an 8-year-old was about to change every careful boundary they had tried to build since the unforgettable night at the gala. Elena looked from Sophie's hopeful face to Declan's quiet expression, searching for the polite way to say no without disappointing a little girl. She had spent the last 3 years keeping her world intentionally small. Work, her apartment, the flower shop, her sketchbook. Those simple routines kept life predictable, and predictable felt safe. Becoming involved with the Whitmore family was the opposite of safe. I do not really teach, she said gently. I just make flowers. Sophie tilted her head. But you made me smile already. That means you are a teacher. Elena could not help laughing. Declan shook his head with an apologetic smile. She has a way of winning arguments. I noticed. Sophie carefully tugged on Elena's sleeve. Just one lesson, please. Elena looked down at the little girl, then at the worn sketchbook still resting against her apron. Finally, she sighed with a smile. One lesson. Sophie threw both hands into the air in celebration. I knew you would say yes. Declan laughed quietly, the sound surprisingly warm. Thank you. I promise we will not take much of your time. Saturday mornings, Elena replied. The shop is usually quiet before lunch. Saturday mornings it is. The following weekend arrived with bright sunshine and cool spring air drifting through Manhattan. Elena had arranged a small work table near the front window with buckets of fresh tulips, daisies, eucalyptus, and tiny white wax flowers. She believed beginners should always start with flowers that were forgiving. Sophie's excitement filled the shop before she even stepped inside. I brought my own garden gloves, she announced proudly. Elena noticed the oversized gloves hanging halfway off the little girl's hands. Those are very official. Daddy bought them yesterday. Declan lifted a paper coffee cup with a slightly embarrassed smile. Apparently the gloves were not optional. Elena smiled as she handed Sophie a pair of small floral scissors with rounded safety tips. Rule number 1, she said. Flowers do not like to be rushed. Sophie nodded with complete seriousness. Just like pancakes. Elena blinked before laughing again. Exactly like pancakes. As the lesson continued, Elena demonstrated how to trim stems at an angle and arrange colors so that every bloom had room to breathe. Sophie copied every movement with determined concentration. Sometimes the bouquet leaned sideways. Sometimes the stems were uneven. Elena never corrected her immediately. Instead, she asked, "What do you notice?" Each time Sophie discovered the answer herself, her confidence grew a little stronger. Declan watched from a nearby chair, pretending to answer emails while secretly observing every conversation. It had been a long time since someone had encouraged Sophie with such patience instead of simply praising or correcting her. Elena treated mistakes as part of learning rather than something to hide. After nearly an hour, Sophie held up her finished bouquet with pride. Several flowers leaned in different directions, and the colors were far from perfect, but the arrangement somehow captured the cheerful spirit of the child who had created it. It is beautiful, Elena said sincerely. Sophie looked surprised. Really? Because flowers should tell the truth about the person arranging them. Yours looks joyful. Sophie's smile stretched from ear to ear. While the little girl wrapped her bouquet in brown paper, Declan wandered toward a shelf displaying several framed botanical sketches. He recognized the same delicate drawing style from the notebook Sophie had accidentally picked up the previous week. Did you draw these? He asked. Elena nodded modestly. Mostly during quiet evenings. They are remarkable. She shrugged gently. They are only ideas. Ideas usually become something bigger. Elena smiled without answering. She had heard encouragement before, but dreams did not pay New York rent. A delivery driver entered the shop carrying several large boxes, interrupting the conversation. Elena immediately excused herself to help unload fresh inventory. Without being asked, Declan rolled up the sleeves of his sweater and lifted the heaviest boxes toward the storage room. You do not have to do that, Elena said. I know. He balanced another box on his shoulder with an easy smile. But I can. For the next 15 minutes they worked side by side, unpacking buckets, organizing ribbons, and stacking supplies. Neither mentioned billion-dollar companies or celebrity gossip. They simply worked. As Elena reached for a bundle of pale blue hydrangeas, she glanced at Declan and realized something unexpected. Inside this tiny neighborhood flower shop, wearing jeans with dust on his sleeves, he looked less like one of the most powerful businessmen in America and more like an ordinary father trying to give his daughter one happy Saturday morning. Outside, Manhattan rushed forward with its usual noise and ambition, but inside the little shop, surrounded by flowers and quiet laughter, 3 lives had begun weaving together in ways none of them could yet imagine. The Saturday lessons quietly became a tradition that none of them had planned. One week turned into another, and before long Sophie measured time not by school assignments or calendar dates, but by how many days remained until she could visit the flower shop again. Every Saturday morning she rushed through breakfast, reminding her father not to forget the oversized garden gloves she insisted were lucky. Elena welcomed her with a smile that seemed a little easier each week, and together they transformed ordinary flowers into colorful arrangements while sharing stories that made the little shop feel warmer than any luxury ballroom ever could. Declan rarely interrupted the lessons. Sometimes he answered work calls outside on the sidewalk before returning with 3 hot chocolates from the neighborhood cafe. Other times he simply sat near the front window reading reports on his tablet, while secretly listening to Sophie explain why yellow tulips looked optimistic and lavender reminded her of peaceful dreams. Elena noticed that despite running one of the country's most successful investment firms, Declan never appeared impatient with his daughter. Every question received a thoughtful answer. Every small achievement earned genuine encouragement. It was a side of him the newspapers never mentioned. One rainy afternoon, after the lesson ended earlier than expected, Sophie looked through the shop window at the gray sky and sighed dramatically. "There goes our walk." Elena smiled. "Rain is good for flowers." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe it is good for people too." Declan laughed. "How did you become the wisest person in the room?" "Because I listened to flowers," she answered with complete confidence. Since the rain showed no signs of stopping, Elena invited them into the tiny break room behind the shop. She brewed fresh chamomile tea while Sophie happily colored blank pages from an old sketch pad Elena kept for children who visited with their parents. The room was simple, with faded cabinets, a small wooden table, and a window overlooking the alley where delivery trucks arrived every morning. Declan glanced around with quiet curiosity. There was nothing expensive or impressive about the space, yet it carried a sense of comfort that money could never purchase. On one shelf rested several framed photographs of flower festivals, handwritten thank you notes from longtime customers, and a small ceramic mug holding colored pencils. Elena noticed him studying the pictures. "Most of those came from community events," she explained. "I volunteer whenever I can." "Even with your work schedule?" he asked. She shrugged. "Not everyone can afford flowers during difficult times. Sometimes hospitals, senior centers, or shelters simply need a little color." Declan remained silent for a moment. In boardrooms, people often spoke about community impact while calculating tax deductions or public relations benefits. Elena spoke about it as naturally as discussing the weather. There was no performance in her kindness. Sophie suddenly looked up from her drawing. "Miss Elena, where do you live?" Elena smiled. "About 15 minutes from here. Can we see your flowers at home someday?" Before Elena could answer, Declan gently interrupted. "Only if Miss Elena is comfortable with that." She appreciated the respect in his voice. "Maybe one day," she replied. 2 weeks later that opportunity arrived unexpectedly. A neighborhood gardening club asked Elena to prepare centerpieces for their annual spring luncheon, but the delivery van refused to start that morning. She stood outside the shop staring at the silent engine with growing frustration. Declan had just arrived with Sophie for their lesson when he noticed her expression. "Something is wrong?" Elena sighed. "Everything is finished except the transportation." Without hesitation, Declan opened the back of his large sport utility vehicle. "We have plenty of room. I cannot ask you to spend your Saturday delivering flowers." "You did not ask," he replied with an easy smile. "I volunteered." Sophie clapped excitedly. Flower delivery adventure. Together they carefully loaded every arrangement into the vehicle, making certain not to damage a single bloom. During the short drive through quiet neighborhood streets, Sophie chatted happily from the back seat, while Elena pointed out local parks, bakeries, and family-owned businesses she loved. Declan realized that despite living in Manhattan for years, he had never explored this part of the city. His world had been built around office towers, private meetings, and carefully scheduled appointments. Elena's world moved at a gentler pace, where people remembered one another's names and stopped to admire window boxes overflowing with spring blossoms. As they unloaded the final arrangement outside the community center, an elderly volunteer hugged Elena warmly and thanked her for donating several bouquets at no charge. Declan watched the exchange without saying a word. In that quiet moment, he understood something no magazine profile had ever taught him. Wealth could build skyscrapers and companies, but generosity was measured in entirely different ways, and somewhere deep inside his carefully guarded heart, admiration had begun transforming into something far more personal. As spring slowly gave way to the warmth of early summer, the Saturdays became something none of them ever questioned. Sophie no longer asked if they were going to the flower shop. She simply packed her garden gloves before breakfast, certain that the morning belonged among blossoms and laughter. Elena found herself setting aside fresh flowers she knew Sophie would love before the little bell above the shop door even rang. Declan, despite a calendar filled with investor meetings and international conference calls, quietly protected those few hours every week as though they were the most important appointment he had. Somewhere along the way, what had begun as an apology had become part of their lives. Then everything changed in a single afternoon. Elena had just finished delivering wedding bouquets when her co-worker rushed toward her holding a phone. "You need to see this." Elena frowned as the video began to play. It was the recording from the charity gala, but this time it had been carefully edited. Every moment before the kiss had disappeared. The footage showed only Declan walking directly toward her, gently kissing her, and then stepping away. Dramatic music had been added beneath the images, along with bold headlines claiming that the billionaire had secretly been involved with the florist for months before abandoning her to protect his public image. Millions of people had already watched it. The comments were even worse. Some accused Elena of chasing wealth. Others insisted she had manipulated the situation from the beginning. She continued watching until another clip appeared. It was an interview recorded outside the gala that same night. A reporter asked Vivian Sinclair whether she had been surprised by what happened. Vivian lowered her eyes with carefully practiced disappointment before answering. "Sometimes people make desperate choices when they feel trapped. I hope everyone involved finds peace." She never directly lied. She simply allowed everyone else to build the story for her. Elena replayed Declan's quiet apology from that night inside her memory. "I made a terrible decision because I wanted the rumors to end." Until that moment, she had believed she understood the whole truth. Now another thought slowly crept into her heart. Had every kind conversation since then been driven by guilt? Had every Saturday been nothing more than an attempt to repair a mistake? Was she simply the woman he happened to choose because she had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time? She quietly placed the phone on the counter and finished wrapping the bouquet in front of her, but her hands no longer moved with their usual confidence. That evening, Declan arrived with Sophie exactly as planned, carrying fresh lemonade for everyone after another unusually warm day. The moment he stepped inside, he sensed something had changed. Elena smiled politely, but the warmth that usually welcomed them had disappeared. Sophie hurried toward the work table with excited energy, completely unaware of the silence between the adults. "Miss Elena, I practiced drawing roses all week. I cannot wait to see them," Elena replied gently, though her voice carried a distance Declan had never heard before. During the lesson, Elena focused entirely on Sophie. She answered every question with kindness, praised every arrangement, and encouraged every smile, yet she barely looked at Declan. The easy conversations they had slowly built over the past several weeks vanished behind careful politeness. When the lesson ended, Sophie wandered toward the front window to admire a display of sunflowers, while Declan quietly approached Elena. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. She hesitated before meeting his eyes. "The answer to that question depends on whether the first day we met was the only honest day between us." Confusion crossed his face. "What do you mean?" She reached for her phone, opened the edited video, and silently handed it to him. Declan watched the screen for less than 30 seconds before his expression fell. He immediately understood who had benefited from the story spreading this way. "Elena, this is not the full truth." She folded her arms, not in anger, but in quiet disappointment. "The full truth is that you kissed me because I was convenient. Everything that came afterward happened because you felt responsible. I finally understand." He took a careful step forward. "No, that may be how it started, but it is not where we are now." She gently shook her head. "Maybe for you. But every time I look at that video, I remember that I was never chosen. I was simply available." Before Declan could find the words that might have reached her heart, Elena removed her apron, carefully folded it on the counter, and whispered, "I think Sophie deserves someone who can teach her without bringing more headlines into her life." She forced one final smile for the little girl, wished her a safe ride home, and quietly walked out of the flower shop, leaving Declan standing among the silent bouquets as the scent of fresh roses suddenly reminded him of the biggest mistake he had ever made. The flower shop felt strangely empty after Elena left, even though every shelf remained filled with fresh blooms and every bucket overflowed with color. Declan stood motionless for several seconds, still holding the phone that displayed the edited video. He had spent years solving impossible business problems with calm logic and careful planning, but none of those skills prepared him for watching someone he cared about walk away believing she had never truly mattered. Sophie slowly walked back from the front window carrying the small bouquet she had arranged only minutes earlier. She looked from her father to the closed shop door before quietly asking, "Is Miss Elena coming back?" Declan forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Not today." Sophie looked down at the flowers in her hands. "Did I do something wrong?" His heart tightened immediately. He knelt beside her and gently shook his head. "No, sweetheart. You did everything right." Then why did she look sad? Children often noticed emotions adults try to hide. Declan searched for an answer simple enough for an 8-year-old, yet honest enough to respect her trust. "Sometimes grown-ups misunderstand each other," he said softly. Sophie nodded without speaking again. During the drive home, she rested her bouquet on her lap instead of talking about flowers the way she always did. The silence inside the vehicle felt heavier than any conversation. Over the next several days, Declan buried himself in work, hoping endless meetings would quiet the thoughts he could not escape. Instead, every conference room reminded him of Elena's small break room, filled with colored pencils and handwritten thank you notes. Every expensive floral arrangement decorating his headquarters reminded him of the joy Sophie found creating imperfect bouquets with her own hands. Even success itself suddenly felt strangely hollow. One afternoon, his executive assistant entered his office carrying a folder filled with media reports. "The online story continues gaining attention," she explained carefully. "Our communications team recommends ignoring it. Public interest should fade within another news cycle." Declan closed the folder without opening it. "Find out who released the edited footage." She hesitated. "Our investigators believe it originated through a public relations agency frequently hired by Vivian Sinclair." Declan remained silent for a long moment. He was no stranger to ambitious people protecting their public image, but manipulating the truth at someone else's expense crossed a line he could not ignore. Still, proving intent would take time, and none of it changed the fact that Elena had already been hurt. That evening he arrived home earlier than usual. Sophie sat at the dining room table surrounded by crayons, construction paper, and flower stickers. "What are you making?" he asked. She held up a colorful drawing of 3 smiling figures standing inside a flower shop. One held a bouquet. One wore a baseball cap. The smallest one wore oversized garden gloves. Above them she had carefully written in uneven letters, "My favorite Saturdays." Declan smiled sadly. "It is beautiful." Sophie looked at the empty chair across the table. "Daddy, can people stop being friends even if they do not want to?" He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "Sometimes they can. Can they become friends again?" He looked at her drawing before answering. "Only if they are willing to tell each other the truth." Sophie considered his words with surprising seriousness. "Then you should tell Miss Elena the truth." Her simple advice echoed in his mind long after she had gone to bed. Later that night, unable to sleep, Declan wandered onto the apartment balcony where Sophie had planted tiny pots of herbs and wildflowers with Elena's encouragement. One small lavender plant leaned toward the city lights, carrying the faint scent that reminded him of quiet mornings inside the flower shop. He suddenly realized the painful truth he had avoided admitting even to himself. At first he had apologized because he felt guilty. Then he had returned because Sophie wanted another lesson. Somewhere between shared cups of hot chocolate, rainy afternoons, flower deliveries, and ordinary conversations, those reasons had quietly disappeared. He no longer looked forward to Saturdays because they helped repair an old mistake. He looked forward to them because Elena had become the brightest part of his week. The realization struck him with complete clarity. Losing media attention would not matter. Losing business opportunities would not matter. Even losing millions of dollars would not hurt the way losing Elena already had. For the first time in years, the billionaire who always knew exactly what came next admitted something he could no longer deny. He was not fighting to protect his reputation anymore. He was fighting for the woman who had taught both him and his daughter that the most beautiful things in life could never be measured by wealth. The following Friday afternoon, invitations began arriving across Manhattan's art, business, and charitable communities. None of them mentioned Whitmore Capital or a corporate celebration. Instead, elegant cream-colored envelopes announced a one-night public exhibition called Blooming Forward, a free showcase celebrating local floral artists whose work had inspired neighborhoods through creativity and kindness. At the bottom of every invitation appeared one handwritten sentence. Every flower has a story. Come discover theirs. Elena almost ignored the envelope when it arrived at the flower shop. She assumed it was another promotional event that had somehow found its way onto the counter. Only when she noticed that the invitation had been addressed to her personally did curiosity win. Her manager smiled as she read it. You should go. You have inspired enough people to deserve one evening away from work. Elena hesitated but finally agreed. The exhibition occupied the renovated atrium of an old Manhattan conservatory filled with sunlight pouring through enormous glass ceilings. Hundreds of fresh flowers transformed the space into a living garden. Roses climbed elegant wooden arches. Hydrangeas floated above reflecting pools. Wildflowers lined winding stone paths. Every arrangement felt familiar somehow. Elena slowly walked farther inside, her heart beating faster with every display. Then she stopped. Mounted beside the largest installation was a framed sketch copied almost perfectly from one page of her worn notebook. She recognized every pencil mark immediately. Beneath it rested a simple plaque, inspired by the quiet beauty imagined by Elena Hartwell. She looked around in disbelief. Another display featured a bouquet built around pale blue hydrangeas exactly as she had once described to Sophie, saying they looked like pieces of the sky. Another recreated the cheerful arrangement Sophie had proudly assembled during her first lesson, imperfect stems included. Another surrounded a single white rose with delicate greenery, quietly honoring the first flower Elena had unknowingly carried away from the charity gala. Every memory had somehow become art. Gentle applause echoed through the conservatory as guests turned toward the central stage. Declan stepped forward wearing a simple navy suit without a tie, looking far less like a billionaire executive than a man carrying something deeply personal. Sophie stood proudly beside him, holding a tiny bouquet wrapped in brown paper. Declan waited until the room grew quiet before speaking. Several months ago, I made one selfish decision in front of many cameras. I believed I could solve one problem without thinking about the stranger whose life I interrupted. I apologized because I knew I had embarrassed someone who deserved better, but something unexpected happened afterward. My daughter met a woman who taught her patience, creativity, and kindness. I met someone who reminded me that success means very little if you forget how to see people instead of headlines. Elena remained perfectly still, unable to look away. Declan continued with calm honesty. Many people have watched an edited version of that first evening. They assumed they already knew the whole story. The truth is much simpler. The first kiss began as an escape from a situation I handled poorly. I have regretted that choice every day since. But everything that followed was real. Every Saturday morning, every conversation, every flower delivery, every smile my daughter carried home. None of those moments were driven by guilt. They became the happiest part of our lives because of one extraordinary woman. The conservatory fell completely silent. Declan stepped down from the stage and slowly walked toward Elena. He stopped a respectful distance away before reaching into his jacket pocket. Resting in his hand was the small pearl hair clip with the tiny cracked crystal that she had lost on the night of the gala. The hotel found this after everyone left, he said quietly. I kept hoping I would return it when I had finally earned the chance. Elena accepted the clip with trembling fingers. It felt strangely symbolic, as though a forgotten piece of that painful night had finally found its way home. Sophie then hurried forward and offered Elena the small bouquet she had been holding. I made this myself, she said with a hopeful smile. Daddy helped wrap it, but I picked every flower because they remind me of you. Tears shimmered in Elena's eyes as she carefully accepted the bouquet. Declan looked at her with complete sincerity. I cannot erase how our story began. I would never ask you to forget it. But I hope one day you will believe the truth that matters most. I did not fall in love because of one impulsive moment. I fell in love while watching you make ordinary days feel extraordinary. And if you can ever forgive my beginning, I would be honored to spend the rest of my life proving that my future will always be honest. For a long moment, the conservatory remained completely silent except for the gentle sound of water flowing through the reflecting pools. Elena looked down at the small pearl hair clip resting in her hand, running her thumb over the tiny cracked crystal. Months earlier, she had believed it represented the most embarrassing moment of her life. Now it had become proof that even broken beginnings could lead somewhere beautiful. She slowly looked up at Declan. There were no reporters shouting questions, no flashing cameras demanding another headline, and no carefully rehearsed speeches left to deliver. There was only a father standing beside his daughter, waiting with quiet hope instead of expectation. Elena smiled through tears that she no longer tried to hide. "The first day we met," she said softly, "I thought you only saw someone convenient." Declan lowered his eyes. "I know. Then every Saturday after that, you gave Sophie your full attention, even when your phone never stopped ringing. You carried flower boxes without worrying who might recognize you. You treated every volunteer like an old friend. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing a billionaire. I started seeing a man trying every day to become the father his daughter deserved." Sophie's eyes sparkled as she slipped her small hand into Elena's. "Does that mean you are not mad anymore?" Elena laughed gently through her tears. "No, sweetheart. I am not mad anymore." Sophie threw her arms around Elena in a joyful hug that made the surrounding guests smile. Declan watched the moment with quiet gratitude, feeling as though the weight he had carried for weeks had finally begun to lift. Several months later, autumn painted Manhattan in shades of amber and gold. On a peaceful corner lined with maple trees, a new storefront welcomed its first visitors. Above the entrance, elegant lettering read Hartwell Floral Studio. The display windows overflowed with seasonal flowers, hand-drawn botanical prints, and photographs from neighborhood workshops where children and seniors created arrangements together. Inside, Elena carefully placed the final bouquet on a wooden table just as the front door opened. Declan stepped inside carrying 2 cups of hot apple cider, while Sophie rushed toward the workshop area where several young children were already putting on oversized gardening aprons. "Miss Elena," one little girl called excitedly, "I remembered to cut the stems at an angle." Elena smiled. "Perfect. Flowers always appreciate patience." Declan looked around the bright studio, noticing framed pages from Elena's original sketchbook decorating one wall. The ideas she once believed were only dreams had become reality. He had quietly financed the building renovation through a community development foundation without taking ownership of the business, exactly as Elena had requested. The studio belonged entirely to her. She had built it with talent, determination, and countless early mornings surrounded by fresh flowers. One quiet evening after the last customers left, the 3 of them walked together onto the small rooftop garden above the studio. Window boxes overflowed with lavender, white roses, and pale blue hydrangeas that swayed gently in the cool breeze. Sophie reached into the pocket of her little cardigan with unusual seriousness. "Daddy," she whispered, "I think it is time." Declan smiled nervously. "I think you are right." Sophie carefully removed a small velvet box and handed it to her father before stepping back with an excited grin. Declan took a slow breath and looked at Elena with the same honesty that had first reached her heart inside the conservatory. "The first time I kissed you, I was trying to escape a mistake. I have wished many times that I could change that moment." He opened the velvet box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that caught the golden evening light. "But if I erased that day, I would also erase every Saturday morning, every bouquet, every laugh, every lesson, and every reason I have to be grateful. I cannot change our beginning, but I can promise that every chapter from this moment forward will be built on truth, respect, and love. Elena Hartwell, will you marry me?" Elena smiled as tears of happiness filled her eyes once again. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Sophie clapped so enthusiastically that several nearby birds fluttered into the evening sky. As Declan gently placed the ring on Elena's finger, she reached into her purse and removed the small pearl hair clip. She fastened it into her hair with a warm smile before looking back at him. "I think it finally belongs to a happy memory." Declan softly kissed her forehead beneath the fading autumn sunlight, not to escape the world this time, but to embrace the family they had chosen together. Below them, the flower studio glowed warmly against the quiet Manhattan street. welcoming everyone who walked through its doors with the same lesson their story had quietly proven all along. Kindness opens hearts, honesty earns trust, and the most extraordinary love often begins where no one expected it to bloom. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.